Hey everyone, I hope you're all well. Rather than do a live stream again this week, I am just recording this ahead of time and I'll post it sometime this week. Although if you're watching it, I've probably already posted it, hence you're watching it. But anyway, I just thought I would give a short chat about Maria Lugones' article, Methodological Notes Toward a Decolonial Feminism. One, because it's great, and two, because I really think that this article serves as a great pivot piece for us in terms of moving from the analytic of coloniality, which Quijano and Castro Gomez and Winter were really, really excellent at providing us all of these resources to understand the depth and nuance and complexity of colonialism and its continued role in constructing our contemporary society and moving towards, all right, what are decolonial ways of thinking, decolonial efforts to undermine, to unsettle, to reimagine what the world could be in more equitable and nuanced and complex ways. And Lugones does a great job of pivoting between the analytic and the sort of creative, imagined future aspect of things because she is making that movement within the article itself. It begins with an attempt to understand specifically the way that the coalition women of color are thought of within feminist theory, and then move to what would it look like to attempt to reimagine the feminism, gender identity, practice, performance, orientation, etc., in decolonial spaces, in non-oppressive, in non-exclusionary ways. That's the shift that's happening in this particular article, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. So a little bit of background on Lugones. She is from Argentina, and she is a philosopher who is currently working at the State University of New York Binghamton campus, which is a major center of decolonial thought in the United States. And her focus has been primarily on the ways that coloniality is shaped by and helps shape our understandings of gender, and specifically the ways that LGBTQIA plus identities are erased under the colonial system. This is also, I would add as a side note, a matter of historical erasure, as the societies and cultures that were conquered during the conquest and during the colonization of the Americas did not have the same understandings of gender and gender identity that we have presently, and that come out of a more European and Eurocentric epistemology or way of thinking. And so there are ways of talking about gender that pre-exist many of the theories of feminism and gender identity, performance, understanding, and whatnot that we are familiar with today. So it's an interesting world to step into, because there's a lot of historical complexity that lays that changed the sound, sorry. A lot of historical complexity that lays on top of the regular old gender theory, regular gender theory, the gender theories that we might be familiar with in the present. All right, so let's jump into this article. So Lugones begins by talking about how feminism has predominantly been connected and arisen out of white spaces. And so white women have been primarily who is figured most prominently in feminist discourse, at least in the West. In like manner, non-whiteness has been primarily understood and associated with and figured in men. So non-whiteness is connected to men, feminism is connected to white women. But what about non-white women? And where do they figure into all of this? This is the question that Lugones begins with. She says there are two ways that we can think about answering this question. The first is to talk about how race and gender don't exist separate from one another, and intersectional theories point to the erasure of non-white women from the legal system and other systems of order. Thus, these systems of order impose a separation between race and gender. Now, the other answer you could give is the one that she's going to lean more heavily into, and that is a coalitional understanding or a coalitional response. Now, a coalition is really just a joint effort of a number of different groups that get together to achieve a common goal. And they don't all share the same identities. They don't all share the same histories. They don't share the same group composition, same experiences, but they want a common goal to be achieved. And in order to do that, they develop what is known as a coalition. So when she uses this term, women of color, Lugones is talking about a coalition, right? It's not a monolith. When she uses this term, it's an umbrella term meant to incorporate multiplicity. Because this coalitional term, women of color, includes racialized and gendered selves that are multiple and that have been historically pointed out by those who are in positions of power to be without authority or to be inferior. Now, this is a fiction, she says, but this is a fiction that is real because it is socially upheld. And as a result, non-white women come to see themselves, they are enculturated to see themselves as without authority, and thus living this fragmented selfhood where they have a kind of double consciousness. They understand themselves as being a person, and yet at the same time they understand themselves as being seen by others as non-white, non-male, thus non-authoritative. All right? The way that she describes this is that this approach erases resistant subjectivities, those ways of being in the world that might undermine or push back against that perceived lack of authority, or even that perception as being inferior. All right? So, moving forward, Lugones states that women of color is to be understood as a coalitional identity that one inhabits actively. A coalition across disparate geographies linked socially in a way that forms us and urges us to learn about each other. One term that we might be familiar with in this class that would qualify as a coalitional identity would be to identify as a Latin American or of Latin American descent or Hispanic descent, Latino, Latina, Latinx descent, that sort of a thing. It's a coalitional identity because while there are similarities amongst those who identify as members of those groups, there is a lot of difference amongst those groups as well. And yet, there is shared interest, there is a shared need to achieve certain goals, social, political, cultural, economic goals. So, Latinidades is Latinness, or Latinesses, is to be understood most properly as a coalitional identity. At least if we're going along with Lugones on this, all right? So, Lugones jumps into a move that we're familiar with, which is the kind of the genealogy or history of particular sets of concepts. So she talks about European man as a figure that is outlined as that which is fit for rule, the heterosexual, the Christian, the rational with a capital R, and European woman is seen as that which reproduces European men. Thus, her identity is meant to supplement and reproduce his identity. Her identity is authorized, licensed by European man. It's a bad situation all around. But she then makes the case that colonized males are judged from the normative understanding of men, which means that colonized males are judged on the basis of that European man fit for rule. So if you create a standard, this is a move that we're very familiar with. You create a standard, and then you apply it to a group of people, and suddenly they don't meet that standard. They had no intention of ever attempting to meet that standard, but you determine them unfit for rule of the place that they've kind of been ruling for a while. And then you can justify getting rid of them. So this, anyway, the whole point here is that what Lugones is doing is she is running through this history and talking about the way that this colonization colonizes not just identity, but also memory, one's sense of self, one's relation to the world. It discredits prior knowledges and introduces instrumental concepts, including instrumental forms of gender. Now, what's meant there is taking something and turning it into that which is assessed only on the basis of use. Is it of use to those in positions of power and authority? Yes, then that's something that we'll stick with. No, then we'll get rid of it, right? And this is where this idea of the erasure of particular identities becomes very, very clear. Because if you can erase a particular way of being in the world, of gender performance, identity expression, and racial identity performance expression, although strike that on the racial performance part. But these two elements of what it means to be a human that play heavily on our humanity, if you can delegitimize certain forms of that because they're not useful, then you shape again who gets included and who gets excluded, right? It's a story that we are familiar with. So then the next move is going to be how we take this understanding and shift it to thinking about a decolonizing of gender. Now, I'll jump into what in this context that term means, because it is a term that unfortunately gets overused and is under considered. We'll put it that way, under considered. And in the next video, I'm going to go into that a bit more. So stay tuned for part 2.